Call the meeting to order. I thought we'd just start by introducing ourselves because there's two different committees. Not everyone knows everyone. So.
Oh, I'm Rebecca Taylor, and I'm on the Shellfish Advisory Board.
Tom Sigia, Shellfish Advisory Board.
Jake Puffer.
Yeah.
Jay Saylor. John Dwayne.
Nancy Chiavetta, Shellfish Constable.
John Reel, I'm the chair of NRAB.
Tom Flynn.
Tom Slack.
We are missing one member who couldn't make it. That's Laura Hewitt. So what we at NRAB are most concerned about is to hear from you guys what you would like us to consider or support in a harbor management plan. We do one approximately every 10 years. I have a copy of the last one. I was just looking through some of the recommendations that we made 10 years ago, and I'm very pleased at how many of them were actually followed up on. Not because anything that we did, we just write lists, but because of the work that was done by the Shellfish Department and the Shellfish Advisory Board. Picked out a couple of things that were missing. One is the effects of dragging on the harbor and oversight of the dragging operations. That may be because I don't know something, so I'd be interested to hear you about that. But the other thing that's interesting was missing was the subject of climate change, which in 2006 was never mentioned. And it's now a critical issue. So I thought we might start with that. We'll jump around from various subjects as people's interests arrive. But climate change does a number of things. The sea level is expected to rise. Water temperature is expected to get warmer. Water more acid, which can affect the shells of shellfish, which are mostly kind of calcium carbonate. More rain, which we're seeing a lot of this fall. More wind, which may tend to more rapidly erode salt marshes and banks. Are there any specific concerns, any specific actions that you would like us to recommend about this? For example, do you see oyster shells getting weaker because of the acidity?
I don't think we've seen anything yet, knock on wood. We have a huge oyster set still, and every year, it varies from year to year, but it's still been really strong. But I think that's probably where we see it first, if the water becomes more acidic, because I've heard that, you know, with more acidic water, the oysters might not be able to spawn as well. So that would be like our first huge concern, because that's one of the things that really makes Wellfleet unique, is being able to catch our own baby oyster set. And a lot of people have farms do that, and we really get a lot of seed from it.
Yeah.
So
I had not heard the connection between acidity and the reproduction, so that's interesting to hear.
Yeah, I know a lot of the hatcheries have had, some of the hatcheries maybe on the West Coast more have had problems with it. But yeah, it's something to think about.
Do you track the population of the set at all? Are these basically just catch?
It's kind of
Catch
statistics. I mean, I have a pretty high yield spot on my site, and some years it's crazy. It's super, super thick, and then other years it's a little bit thinner, which can be nicer because the oysters grow better on the spat collectors, but I don't think we really track it from year to year.
Not to my knowledge, it hasn't been tracked. The recruitment of oysters year in and year out.
It would be an interesting thing to do, because then we could get a baseline. Now I'm sure there's different ways we could do it, whether checking the water column or just putting out spat collectors in different parts of the harbor and getting.
Haven't they done something? There is going to be a study done with Barbara Brennisel and John Portnoy are gonna kind of expand on the study that Audubon did, and it's basically, they wanna see pre-Herring River restoration, what recruitment
Yeah.
is like in the Herring River area, and then, since they were gonna do that, why don't we compare it to other areas of the harbor, which was done, I think, by Audubon a number of years ago. So they're going to use the exact, in order that that study can be comparable, they're gonna use the same methods. But I think that'll give us some good baseline data for then the eventual Herring River project and the recruitment of spat before and after. And then also just as a follow-up to the study that was done by Mass Audubon a number of years ago. So that study is planned.
Just gonna mention, I think I remembered having that study, and there was something done, is that the same thing that was done over by Mayo Creek? I think,
Similar,
okay.
very similar idea.
Could we track how much spat or how much we collected just by people voluntarily being like, I caught this much seed, you know? Or even the donations that you got, just a roundabout what you got donated, start taking data collection on.
Is it, when you're, say you're measuring your spat, you said you have these observations, you're not counting them. I mean, there's millions of them.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you, weigh them, or?
No, you just look at them, you know, the splat collectors
They're
like
just the
this.
coverage?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You just look at the coverage.
I've counted them before and have done like a volume, you know, used a graduated cylinder and seen how much.
Okay, you make a tentative count or a pre-count.
Yeah.
And then say, these weigh a pound. If I've got 5 pounds, I have 5 times as many as I counted
Or if
probably.
it displaces.
Yeah, okay, or displacement.
Yeah, so I've done that before, just to see how much I've gotten and to see how much to put into the bags, so.
But at the present, we don't have any, wild capture of the recruitment of spat in the wild from any area.
One of the things behind my question is I've had a recommendation from Audubon also to create an oyster reef or down in the south end of the harbor. You may remember they tried this off of Lieutenant Island and it failed because of sedimentation. So we would have to.
I wouldn't say that failed though, like, so.
Okay.
People didn't see the production of it because they were hand picking. But if you go out dragging to certain spots, you can drag up those blocks that they used and it's just loaded. Like,
Yeah, they originally caught oysters and it did okay
it
for
did, yeah.
a
That's-
little while, and it was there,
Yeah,
and they
fair
had their own
enough.
little plot,
That-
and then it got wiped out by the ice.
And that ice moved it to a really awesome spot. That's a really
If you're
great
dragging.
spot.
Yeah. It just kind of scattered it.
Sort
You
of.
drag up some of the blocks and things.
Yeah, the whole thing pretty much moved to one area, and it's a really productive area.
And where did it end up?
Oh, wait a minute, I can't tell you that.
Oh,
Yeah, that's one of the challenges here with
Who's got that?
That's one of the challenges with oyster reefs is you put them too high up, and they can get taken out by ice. You put them too low, and they'll most likely get dragged up unless you can close an area.
That's sort of like the good thing about like culch and the propagation thing. It not only propagates it like where people can hand pick, but it also propagates where people can drag because ice comes and takes that and moves everything all around the harbor.
Yeah, it's true.
So once you find where, if you can watch the ice and see where it is in the winter time, you can get a pretty good idea of where it's going to be good in the future, or, you can see what's happening, and, yeah.
So was ice the reason that those oysters got covered over that year? That they were there for a couple of years and they were growing and then they got displaced by ice?
Yeah,
and
the ice
sediment?
took that entire,
Took the sand and everything with it and
it
just
took the
put,
entire, whatever the
Project?
Audubon, yeah, that was gone.
Huh.
So whenever people are like saying, you know, they're like, oh, that failed miserably, I'm like, not for me, it didn't.
Was that in 2016?
I don't know.
I think it was a little earlier.
I agree.
Now, we talk about these conditions that we're expecting, and I know we have one buoy out in the, as I understand it, anyone please correct me. We have one buoy out there measuring nitrates in the harbor. And I read your report and one of the, that you passed on to us. And there were some sample testings of pHs and temperatures and that over a couple studies. We do not, do we have any continuous pH or temperature buoys
Center-
out there?
The Center for Coastal Studies has ongoing monitoring that they're doing at different points around.
But that's just when they come down and drive out in the boat and take the temperature, or is it always there?
Yeah, I think it's always there.
Well, I think also it says in this report that you guys gave us, it says that the Center for Coastal Studies has one on
The pier.
the pier and over by the break wall.
By the jetty?
Yeah, and it seemed, from the data here, it looks like that they collect it regularly since 2006.
Yeah, I couldn't tell from that when I read it, maybe it's my understanding, that whether these were samples or these were averages of continuous, because it's listed by the year. And I didn't know if they just took samples, you know, once a year or every so many months or.
Isn't there a website? Maybe from the Center for Coastal
Yeah,
Studies?
they do have a website. You can get the data
Yeah, because
there.
they've got the data, because they told us we could get it any time. But like they
Yeah.
were, I think that was continuous.
Scientist that runs it is Amy Costa.
Okay.
Yeah, they've done some good work for us, but I couldn't tell if that was continuous or not.
Okay, so we need to make sure it's continuous.
David, you mentioned dragging is just walking down to the harbor, as my wife and I often do. I had thought over the past 2 or 3 years, I saw less evidence of dragging than I would have seen 5 or 10 years ago. Is that a fairly steady operation, or is it quite variable? Maybe my impression is totally wrong, which is why I'm asking the question.
I think some people do it year-round. There hasn't been, I think there's more people doing it now, but it hasn't been, you know, I think some people take out, like I take out around Thanksgiving, maybe like around
Okay.
December. Some people stop like around Christmas, some people go year-round. So, yeah, I mean, it's,
But as far as you know, it's a perfectly viable
yeah.
business here in
Yeah,
South.
yeah, I mean, you
Okay.
could, I think somebody could do it year-round, no problem, and like, I think it could support anything.
Okay, so my impression was wrong, that's why I asked the question, to get corrected.
No, I think a lot of the reason why people don't do it is because they don't know how to do it, it costs money to get
Sure.
started in it. And I think there's just a lack of knowledge of how to do it, and so I think that's why people aren't really doing it. And they don't know, they just don't know. So,
Do you think there's more boats out there than 5 years ago?
I don't know. Do you know?
No.
What do you
It's a
think,
Mike,
Nancy?
it's a Mike
There's more
Flanagan
boats than
question.
2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
You mentioned the pH as being a problem. What about water temperature if we start to see a rise? I know it's affected the lobster fishery in places, but do you think that's going to affect you guys, or?
Yeah, I don't
Well,
know.
that's how we got Vibrio.
Yeah, I guess
That
so.
affected us.
Yeah.
And perhaps it would increase this time for spawning of shellfish and increase the growth period.
According to one of the talks at the State of the Harbor Conference, the temperature, and their data set was from the Gulf of Maine, but it was changing how the plankton, instead of peaking twice, they're peaking sort of slower and longer, but at different rates than they used to, and that's going to affect our growth habits for cohogs and oysters and how they're responding to that.
It's just that phenology talk.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Can I ask a question about, I don't think anybody's been here for 50 years, but I noticed the Kerley Report that we were talking about at the conference was back in 1969, landings were 90% quahogs and 7.5% oysters. What's up with that? I mean, how come that it's like almost reversed now? Is it just because people are putting effort into it, because we realize that
Because
we
it's
could
mostly
culture,
farming
if we
quahog,
culture,
farming
if we kept
oysters
culture?
now, where it used to be wild quahogs.
I'm sorry?
Mostly farmed oysters would be my guess.
Wasn't there a shift too?
There has been.
And people wanted to, because there was a shorter turnaround for growing oysters, you could make more money on it in a shorter turnaround. So
And there have been
everybody-
diseases in the quahogs, and the growth rate has slowed, and it's by more than 5%.
And then now it seems to be like people who have stuck with clams are doing better, and that's.
It's finally
will
coming back.
probably be another cycle, you know? So,
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons I ask is that it seems like, and you know, I guess is dissolved oxygen another thing that they check for at the pier, right?
I remember all the things they checked.
I'm just wondering if you compare what the state of our water is from 1969 compared to now. It seems to me you should be able to, like at the pier especially, you should be able to determine if the water, there's like better dissolved oxygen, or because there's more oysters. It's, you know, Anna Marie Frankich, who a lot of you might know, she did that reef down by the marina, experimenting to see what benefits the oysters might have. It was like a 5-year thing, and then that winter storm back in 2016 just kind of, or 15 it might have been, covered them all over. But the dissolved oxygen content down there was quite a bit better all around the oysters for the whole time. And more oysters went, the more you cultured, the more they grew, and the better the water was down there. And that's a pretty bad spot for, you know, it's one of the recommendations that, you know, it's one of the places that the water quality is not good in Wellfleet Harbor. And
I can't remember, did they do like a control for, here's a bunch of debris that also causes the water to churn up, to see if maybe that was like an air bubbler in a fish tank that creates more oxygen because it's agitating?
you mean because of the oysters?
Yeah.
Well, see, the
Wondering if there
oysters,
was
they
more-
left the oysters there alone for like at least 3 years until they got covered over, and then they decided they better let people go down there and pick them, otherwise it would just be a waste. So they were letting them grow year after year, to the best of my understanding, and that's why it kept improving. So that, you know, you would wonder if the water quality could actually be better now, because there's so many more oysters in the harbor than there used to be. That's, you know, when you're getting 90% quahogs and 7.5% oysters, you would think that that means there's a lot less oysters in the harbor, or people would have been picking them. Right? So that's my guess anyways. So one of the things that she did as part of that study is she's written a paper now that's going to be published next year, and it's about the oysters and the effects on water quality in Wellfleet Harbor. It's going to be all about Wellfleet, and she, you know, she's listed 1 million places where oysters should go that would really help. You know, if we have, I don't know how many million oysters there are in the harbor right now. I really don't want to get into numbers, but let's say there's 2 million, which is a lot more than that. She proposes that there should be as many as 10 million, you know.
Who is this again? I'm sorry.
Anna Marie Frankich, she's a professor at UMass Boston.
Yeah, she worked with Kurt Felix. They did that,
The culture.
that culch right at the corner of
Mayo Creek.
Mayo Creek, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
didn't we harvest something like 10 million?
I'm sorry?
No, there's 10 million oysters were grown and sold agriculturally. Yes, last year.
Okay, there you
So
go.
so
Just,
we're-
that's only 10 million that were sold from farms.
So we're hitting that mark then.
Well, those numbers,
you're just-
those
yeah,
numbers were
okay,
totally
okay,
just to
yeah,
make a
just
point.
Harvard, yeah,
There
okay.
could be 100,000,
Yeah.
100 million, I don't know what the number is. I should have, the report's available now, there's a draft report that Kurt sent me, and I spoke to Anna Marie about it through email.
No, this is where, when Sarah Peak and Julian were here, Mike was saying that it would take 20 million more oysters on top of the oysters that we had now to, or 25, I don't know, it's 25 million to help clean the nitrogen load.
Okay.
Is that
Well-
doable?
Well, apparently it is, when you look at history. So in her paper, I remember reading that there was.
But they say that there's no science backing it too, so.
Well, I can tell you, when you look at harvest rates and you look at what happened, I think it was the 1800s or something like that, she was quoting the boats that would come into Wellfleet Harbor and load it up with oysters. And the volume of oysters that were going out of Wellfleet Harbor at that time totally blows away what we're doing now. And so that would lead you to believe that there was oysters at one time that were piled so deep and so thick that they just kept growing and growing and growing, and people could pick away and pick away. And
There's one of Belding's reports talking about the area just south of Lieutenant Island, said that when he wrote this report, which is in the early 1900s, there were no oysters there. And that had been a very productive place in the past. I think we keep running across this question of how much do we have of what? And one of the things that you'll hear us talk about a lot is something called a Kerley Report. And this was John's got a couple of copies you could pass around. It was a report that was written by some scientists from the Division of Marine Fisheries. And what they did is they went around Wellfleet Harbor and they sampled not only oysters and shellfish, but lots of other living creatures. Finfish, they looked at baitfish, mummichogs, and fish like that. And it's an interesting benchmark report, but it's more than 50 years old. And one of their recommendations is it should have been redone every 5 or 10 years and was never redone. And I'm sure that our final set of recommendations is going to have a suggestion that it be redone, and oyster count and quahog could be part of it. Another thing I'm very interested to see is have written out the data on horseshoe crabs because they're an important part of the population. My particular favorite is the little baitfish, mummichog silversides, which spawn and grow in the salt marshes. And the salt marshes are breeding grounds for those. And so monitoring the population of those fish is a measure of the health of the salt marshes, but also they eventually end up feeding striped bass and bluefish. Yes, Ellen?
And they eat mosquitoes.
Thank you very much. They
Leave that out.
They eat mosquitoes up in the salt marshes. That's what they look on. So John, maybe you want to say a few more things about the Kerley Report?
Yeah, so I actually put a poster together for this year's conference that was about the Kerley Report, just because 50 years is a long time, and it did in the end of the report, the last recommendation they make was that this report should be recreated every 10 years to establish records of what's going on. And the Center for Coastal Studies is a guy named Owen Nichols who actually was thrilled with this, the fact that there was a poster about this report. They did the most recent study, which was Pleasant Bay. The Friends of Pleasant Bay got together and coughed up some money and hired the Center for Coastal Studies to go down and study Pleasant Bay, very similar to what we did in Wellfleet. That's the most recent one that was done. And the silversides were the most common bait fish then, that was in 2015, I think, as they were back in 1969, even in Pleasant Bay. So it's a very common bait fish, and they kept track of. They got other things down. They got gem clams is their big thing down in Pleasant Bay, which we don't have up here, I guess. Is that correct?
I think we have them.
We do have them? Oh, all right.
Who was the woman who did the report on the black custard?
Yeah,
She found
gem clams.
gem clams in 2 different locations in
Oh, there we
Wellfleet.
go. Well, so those are the kind of things that we should be keeping track of. That's kind of why I asked the question that, you look at the numbers now and what the landings are, and obviously oysters exceed quahogs by quite a bit. And somebody should be keeping track of things like blood clams, which people weren't, was off people's radar. Now, I had people come to me at the conference and say they recall clams being around years ago, but nobody fished for them. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. It seems to me it's been the last 4 years or something, 3 or 4 years.
No, I think I can tell you in a minute
Okay.
when we started.
So the bottom line is that there should, considering Wellfleet is known as a shellfish town, and the Wellfleet Harbor is a very critical, it's a big part of everybody's life out here. 15% of the people are directly employed in some kind of fishing or use of the harbor. And that it's worth keeping track of. We should actually have somebody that, I didn't get to the point of which I asked Owen. I should have just asked him how much Center for Coastal Studies would charge to do a report like that. But we should think about doing that. We've had Mark Borelli did that benthic study of the bottom, which is it's one thing to do, but it seems to me somebody should be keeping track of species, landings. When you look at what went on with this report, which at the time is just seems like a fairly thin little book right now, but there's a lot of information in there. They did everything. They did birds. It's a whole section on birds, how many, different species of birds were observed. And it was a year's project. So it requires dragging, it requires beach seining, and it would be, I think it would be a good idea to make a push to try and figure out a way to come up with funding for this, get the community interested in it, and see if we can't do another Kerley Report in 2020.
That is a good idea. I think it would help all of us to be able to farm better and just
Absolutely.
see cycles and.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started, I haven't been here as long as a lot of people, but when I came here in '66 for the first time, there wasn't really any aquaculture going on. There wasn't any cages out on Field Point where I used to come all the time. But all the oysters in the water right now, it seems to me, are going to be having a positive effect. And if it is true that 8 or 10 times the amount of oysters that we currently have is what was around back in 1800s, and this was the result, maybe we should look at culturing more and encouraging more oyster growth.
Go back to the question of climate change. One of the concerns is we're not quite sure what's going to happen. And when you're trying to think of a ecosystem that's resilient to change, with weather change, you need a good gene pool. You need a lot of biodiversity. Do you consciously think of having when you bring in seed and oysters from other areas, do you consciously think about trying to have a broader gene pool, or is this something that maybe happens just by chance or doesn't happen at all?
I'm pretty sure that does happen. I think ARC does that. I think, right?
I don't know.
Okay. And,
On the hatchery level, they might think about that, but
Yeah,
for an
that's what-
oyster
yeah.
farmer, we just
You
buy seed that works. We want to
buy
get the
that
seed to
what
market.
works,
So if,
right.
but people buy from a lot of different hatcheries, so there ends up being,
You're-
I guess, the same species but different. I don't know where they get the brood stock from, but I'm sure it comes from a lot of different places.
we would be getting, we get genes from everywhere, all over the place, all spawning in the harbor.
How did the,
Because
Because things come in from other harbors.
yeah, I mean, there's hatcheries, we're getting seed from Maine and from New Jersey and
Your shuttle.
all putting it into the harbor. So you're getting, I mean, in this shellfish management plan, it says that they think that most of our original oysters
From the Chesapeake.
are from the Chesapeake.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right, I
our
read that.
original oysters aren't even in the gene pool anymore.
Yeah.
So I think we do have a ton of biodiversity.
Yeah,
And
it's like,
yeah.
at what point do the oyster genes change? Like, I don't really have an understanding of it. Like, so you have oysters in Wellfleet Harbor, and they spawn and reproduce, and you have the oysters, the same oysters. Is that the same gene pool? And then you bring in other oysters, then you take those oysters out, spawn them. It's kind of,
Well,
I don't really know how to think about it.
Rebecca mentioned the problem of the oyster set being affected by the water temperature.
Yeah.
The phenology, that's a long word. That if it was first noticed with birds, and birds nest, let's say, according to the sun, but if the temperature gets hotter before the sun reaches a certain period in the sky, insects will pop out before the bird's nest. So there's a mismatch and the productivity goes down. And the hope is among ornithologists is the way you overcome that is that the birds have a sufficiently broad gene pool that they can begin to nest earlier in the year.
I see.
And the same sort of thing happens with any wild species.
I think,
But I'm encouraged that,
I think
you know, that
that
you've sort of naturally got that that's happening naturally.
that might happen too, like, cause I mean, people speculate all the time, they're like, oh, like, we caught an early set this year, you know, like, usually it's like July 4th or something, like, you have to get your hats in by July
Yeah,
4th. And then some people will be like, oh, I got mine in late and I didn't catch anything. Now, I don't know if their, like, gear got fouled or they put it in too early or something, you know, but there's, like, people talk about that, you know, like, the water temperature's coming up, so now they're gonna spawn, or, you know, so maybe that has something to do with it too, you know, the gene pool of different species spawning at different times and different temperatures, I don't know.
It would be good to have a conversation with your supplier of seed. I'm sure they think about it, so I mean, this is hardly a surprise, but it's something we're likely to say something about in our report, that it's important.
John, in our report, can we start, the group here should just decide what we want to start measuring, what we want to start looking at. Water temperature, pH, acidity, et cetera. Just figure out what our metrics want to be, where we want to test each water spot.
That's good, because
And then we can discuss results after the fact.
it's a good idea.
That's why I was wondering about the testing points. Is it continuous? How many
Yeah,
are
well,
there?
the testing point, I mean, to Tom's suggestion, the testing points aren't necessarily cited where the shellfish grants are. So, I mean, you might find a different set of temperatures and acidities off of the breakwater as compared to in Blackfish Creek.
I think we pretty much need to have like an ongoing Kerley report, like for everything.
Including temperature.
Yeah, everything.
And they did, I mean.
And where does the
they
funding
measured
come from?
temperature.
Yeah, we just need
Yeah,
somebody to
right.
do that.
Because that's great, but
I,
you can't pay for
Figure
it.
out, I think,
Well, how do you pay for it? So
that's what I was
there's
just
a
gonna
way.
say.
Right.
That's why the
So,
Kerley report.
all right,
has
so
been
I can tell you, when Bob Prescott was at the conference, and he's been pushing for this for years too. And he said that could cost as much as $100,000. And I said, well, it seems to me it might even be more than that. But the fact is that we have Nancy knows the numbers with shellfish alone and what our harbor is worth. And there's gotta be a way that there could be some kind of revolving fund or some kind of thing that people contribute to that collects for 10 years, and at the end of 10 years, you do another 1-year study. And every 10 years isn't that unrealistic, and I think that there's enough people that make a lot of money off the harbor in here that there should be a way. And you would think that the town and the state should figure out a way to cough up money for that too. I don't
Penny
think
per
it's un-
oyster in 10 years is $100,000.
Yes, there's the advertising slogan already, you know?
What was that, Glenn?
Penny and oyster.
Trying to raise a little humor
Well,
here.
Nancy's gonna give you a thermometer and a pH meter to every shellfisherman when you buy your license.
Actually, one of the things that I would add to that is, that I'm concerned about and gets very little talk is wind. And because the wind direction has a big effect on shoreline erosion and moving sediment around. So I think we could take Tom's idea, and we could have proper monitoring stations all through the Shellfish area. That would be very interesting. Helen, you had a question?
So, sitting in on the Herring River committee meetings year after year, they're doing a lot of monitoring for baseline now.
Right.
And it seems to me that monitoring the baseline population across the board, not just going for the, pH and all that in the larger harbor, because whatever happens with the estuary, with the river, flushing more, is going to affect everything in the harbor. I would just ask Martha Craig, in other words, see if there's some overlap there that might get funded in conjunction with the Herring River. Because it's definitely going to affect things, and they definitely need baselines, and they've already got them for a lot of other things.
Somebody asked me a question at the conference about opening up the Herring River going to affect Mayo Creek, and I didn't have an answer for it. I mean, you would think it would have some effect on it, but I have no idea.
Tomorrow, the Herring River, Friends of Herring River is having a meeting, I think it's, I'll look it up, 4 to 6 here, I believe, to talk about the project with their stakeholders group, and the topic is shellfishing in particular. So I think we should all attend that tomorrow. I'm just trying to remember if it's 4 or 4:30. But they're going to be talking exactly about 4:30 to 6:30 right here. Friends of the Herring River stakeholders group is going to be discussing shellfishing.
Nancy, how frequently does the state test the water, and is that public?
Yes, I don't know if they post it anywhere, but I know they send me the results. It's 5 times a year for open classified areas.
Is it just one site, or do they do a number of sites around
They
it?
do every single water area in the town, from Duck Creek to the Herring River to Logie Bay,
Because it's
Jeremy's. They do the oceanside beaches. They do the Cape Cod Bayside.
because we have to put on our tags. I don't know if you guys know this, but we're split up by classification. So the main harbor is CCB 11, and then the different Duck Creek CCB 13, Herring River is CCB 12, and when we tag our stuff, so that's the different areas that the state tests.
Yep.
So should we, both of these boards, make recommendations to do some kind of Kerley report or data monitor, record taking of data?
As I said, the main purpose of this is for you to help us with our report, but if you wanted to support that in a report of your own, I would be delighted, sure.
Did you guys do a water quality section?
It's interesting to read our report from 2006. There was a lot about water quality and nitrogen.
Yeah.
That was a time that the MEP process was getting going, and there was a lot of sampling around Wellfleet Harbor for nitrogen issues, and that's what has led to the Comprehensive Wastewater Planning Committee, which is it's their main charge. So I think, Jake, what we're likely to say in our report is we need to bring that work to a practical point of implementation.
Yeah.
When you were talking about wind.
So I don't think we're gonna say anything new about water quality testing, except for these stations we've been talking about. But the important thing is to support what the wastewater committee's doing.
Yeah, because that's kind of where it starts and stops with us is water quality. As long as we have clean water, we can continue to do this. If we don't, if the
That's
shuts us down, then there's nothing we can do. So that's kind of the most important thing from a
Well,
shellfishing perspective.
You're right. You know, the fact is, this idea that we report nitrates, and that there was it CCPA or whatever it is that does the water quality? The lady made a presentation at one of our meetings about the water qualities in the ponds and things. But anyway, this high nitrate level does not necessarily mean anything as far as the water quality. I mean, we can drink nitrates till they're up to our ears. And nitrates feed plankton, and plankton is what the oysters eat. It's not a matter of the quality. The quality is, like you say, it's still clean water. If it's got too many, solids in it, if it has too much algae growing in it, if it, those are the things that are real quality breakers. But just the nitrogen values alone are meaningless.
Switch subjects a little bit. One of the things that I know we will be concerned about with climate change is sea level rise and the effect that has on salt marshes, which I personally I've already seen some changes. I like to go over to Middle Meadow, and 20 years ago, if you walk around Middle Meadow, most of the grasses there were salt marsh hay, high marsh grasses. And now it's about 50-50 salt marsh hay and cordgrass, which is low marsh grass. So you could see the effect of the water rise. There's a theory that as this sea level rise happens, the salt marsh will migrate inland to compensate. But I'm concerned that that's very difficult in Wellfleet, because in Wellfleet you've got a salt marsh and then you usually have hills coming right down to it. Now the Conservation Commission is trying to create some rules that say that if you happen to live in a house which borders a salt marsh and the salt marsh tries to come in and move up your property, you're not allowed to put in some sort of a breakwater or a barrier there. Whether this will be accepted or not, I don't know. I was interested in this report, which the Shellfish Advisory Board had done a few years ago, written by a man called Seth Tuller, which is really a really good report. I mean, there's some things which I could nitpick about, but it's basically a sound piece of work which is still useful, extremely useful. And it's interesting to read one of his recommendations about salt marsh. He recommends salt marsh restoration, oyster reef restoration, and eel grass restoration, because these changes all tend to buffer against storm surges and provide for sustainable water. And I've always been interested in eel grass. And in the Shellfish Management Plan from 2007, there's a paragraph that in 1978, when Robert Wallace was the shellfish constable, he did an experiment in which he set aside a couple hundred acres of the harbor closed to dragging, and this was where the scallops were historically found. And according to the data that was reported at that time, there was a scallop harvest of 6,000 plus bushels. It's quite a lot of scallops. It's the largest on record in the past 45 years. And I was fascinated by the report, and some of you are too young probably, but were you aware of that work? And sort of why was it started, and more particularly, why did it end? And maybe I got to go introduce myself to Mr. Wallace. I know who he is, but I've never really sat down and talked with him.
Yeah, I haven't heard about it.
I read that. I was thinking you could actually do some kind of that research now, because we have that closed area that nobody can fish from the breakwall to that triangle that's always closed
The
down.
recreational,
The recreational area, and then there's an area that nobody can ever drag. And who knows what's in there? And that is like a totally virgin area that nobody goes there. So you have like a little fish bank already going on.
I asked Walter Barron where he thought this was, and he thought it was down near Jeremy Point.
That's where I think it says
Yeah.
it says the south side of the harbor.
Yeah.
The southerly part of
Okay.
the harbor. But that's where all the scallops are now too,
Okay.
the southerly part of the harbor, so.
Do we have,
But the fascination, I mean, there's several fascinations about it, but one of them is that eel grass supplies some of the same benefits to a harbor as a salt marsh. You know, provide nutrients, provide spawning ground shelter, help keep the water clean. So if we do lose salt marsh due to sea level rise, it would be useful to have some alternatives to help maintain the quality of water. This is something that's, I mean, all of this is 10, 20 years out. This is nothing imminent. So we have time to think about things.
I need to refresh my memory on that, but when I go on to some of the state mapping tools,
Yeah.
and you can add in layers, they're kind of interactive. Wellfleet Harbor doesn't really have mapped eelgrass habitat. On the outside, like where the Losh House is, like by the
Yeah,
gut,
yeah.
that has mapped eelgrass habitat. So I need to refresh my memory.
Well, I had a second person confirm something like this. I talked with Walter Barron over the weekend. And he also had seen eelgrass in this area, on the inside. So I think that this,
So maybe the
it may have
state's
all,
mapping
it may
doesn't
have
go
all,
back.
it may have all died now,
Yeah, maybe the state's mapping doesn't go back that far.
but maybe the state mapping doesn't go back that far.
Because Bobby was in the 80s.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting to figure out.
yeah.
It's not a fun question. It's what does dragging do to eelgrass? And why is it that at least some time ago, when the Shellfish Committee was researching scallops and their relationship to eelgrass, I learned that in Connecticut, you weren't allowed to drag it. But I don't know enough about this, and so, I ask people at the table, and they know anything about what dragging does to eelgrass.
Dragging kills eelgrass.
Shreds it.
I mean,
It
like, that's
scrapes it
that's
off.
well known. There isn't really eelgrass in Wellfleet Harbor. There just isn't. There's a lot of bay scallops. Like I think I told you.
Yeah, they come around the corner. Yeah.
There's
Particularly good year
There's
for
literally bay
scallops.
scallops everywhere. Like you cannot not catch a bay scallop. Now, there's parts of the harbor that are even on the north parts of the harbor, there's areas right outside of the breakwall where you could catch bay scallops. And then there's areas south of the harbor where you can really catch bay scallops. But there's literally not one part of the harbor where
maybe
You cannot
maybe
get-
that's because there's no eelgrass concentrated anymore, 'cause they used to all be in the eelgrass, now they're all over the place.
I know there's a lot of eelgrass on the
they
outside.
move. It's not like
Yeah.
a bay scallop is just like,
It's not like an oyster that attaches to something.
well, they do attach to stuff when they're young, but there's a lot of substrate in the harbor that they can attach to. I don't know, there's literally, I think on any given day, anybody's gonna finish a day catching whatever with a few bushels of bay scallops at least. So, I mean, they're gonna be crappy Wellfleet bay scallops, but they're everywhere. So, I mean, you can see the little tiny seed attached to everything. So,
I believe that DMF is in the middle of a 3-year study on the effects of dragging on eelgrass, because they present at the Mass Shellfish Officers Association meetings. So they haven't done a final report, they just kind of update us as they're going, and they're using underwater cameras to track it as well, but to see if there's any lasting impacts.
Well,
Well,
David's
Wallace's assumption was he should stop dragging in the area where he wanted to do this study.
Well, his comments and tools, Wallace, whoever here, apparently, if you have a eel glass refuge, and the oysters, or the scallops move around enough, if they start there, and then once they grow, they move, and like you're saying, you're seeing scallops where there isn't even any structure for them to hide in.
There's scallops, yeah, I mean,
They swim around.
there's literally scallops everywhere. I mean, there's scallops that are not moving also because they have growth on them and they can't.
They can't.
I mean, you can see those,
Worms.
those,
The worms, the white
oh,
worms.
those,
Oh, the
those things
slipper
that,
shells?
yeah, slipper shells, yeah. Upper top, I call them upper decks. They're on everything. They're on those
Oh, yeah, the ones,
Refresh my memory on the lifespan of a scallop.
18 months.
18 months, okay.
18 months.
I was gonna say, they don't make it 2 years, so,
So,
all right.
I don't know, I mean, I don't see like a problem with, or a decrease in bay scallops at all. I think that is a very viable resource.
Are we having a good year for them this year?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what I heard. So how do you explain that?
I think the past few years have been a good year for them. I don't know.
How about the
No,
flounder?
Yeah, there's
The f-
flounders.
And the flounder are affected by the dragging too.
Well, there's flounder out there, though. I mean, it's weird. It's like there's a lot of life out there. I think the fact that nobody knows what's out there and they don't actually see what's going on, nobody knows, and they just are like, well, this is, like, we're in dire straits, and I don't think we are.
The Kerley Report, I thought it was funny because it said like there's no hope for a scallop fishery
It's like-
long-term.
It's like totally the
Yeah.
opposite. And
See?
Doubtful that that bay scallops will ever support a substantial fishery in town. So this is like 1969 is when it was done, but, you know, it is cyclical. And I forget what else I was reading, 20-year cycles.
Yep.
So we could be in the beginning or in the middle of a very good cycle. And, management is important too. With such a short lifespan, you want to make sure that you're not letting them all die, but that the ones that can spawn are spawning to create future populations.
I mean, there's eel grass out by Billingsgate,
I know.
and it's all on the East Ham side of that. There's eel grass there, so I don't know if that's helping, and they blow into the harbor, but
As you know, the scallops can move around on their own. They're different than
Yeah.
quahog or oyster.
Yeah, but it's not like they migrate like fish.
yeah, right.
No,
They're not going far, and I'm getting the most of them on my grant as seed. They're not coming in as full-grown. They're coming into my clam seed boxes
Where are you, Rebecca?
on Mayo Beach.
they're an Indian neck in the seed boxes
I mean, they're
too,
coming
and
right
in
into,
grow
right under
bags.
all of my gear out there as babies, as juveniles that can float in through the
I'm
window
trying to
screen.
remember what the basic current is around Wellfleet Harbor, but I think the water comes in at Billingsgate and then runs up
Towards
past
the-
Great Island and around, so it's what is that, clockwise rotation. So that would take things eventually across to where your grant is, particularly if they're as mobile and free swimming as
Well, the
scallops are.
spawn, they sure are, just like oysters, so.
I mean, there's a lot of little baby bay scallops.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the wind moving sediment, like I was looking at the pictures of the sediment moving around Wellfleet Harbor, and then I was looking at this report on like the climate, the working group of climate change impacts.
Yeah, that's what I refer to as, Seth Tuller is the author, so I
Yeah.
refer to it by his name.
I thought that was awesome too, and so there's like all these recommendations of what we should be doing, and I was with all these these climate change outcomes like episodic flooding and chronic inundation of environmental sea level rise and coastal erosion, you know, there's, none of the recommendations recommend dredging. None. And none of it recommends against beach replenishment, like sand replenishment. So like, when I was at the State of the Harbor conference, not this year, the year before, you can see, I think you might have been presenting how everything moved, the sand moved in the harbor.
No, that would have been Mark Borelli
Yeah.
probably.
So
He works for the Center for Coastal Studies.
you have like Eastham replenishing their beaches every year. All of that moves up towards Wellfleet and they keep adding more and more sand, and every year it goes away. And then they add more truckloads of sand, and that's all coming into Wellfleet. So, and then there's no recommendations for dredging, and there's no recommendations for more shellfish propagation as a buffer for pH rises, all these like horrible, scary things that can happen.
Well, you gotta, I don't know exactly what Seth Tooler's title is. SERI was the name of and I don't even recall what that acronym is, SERI. It's where he's from, it's an institute, it's on the middle of Massachusetts. I think everybody's got their own perspective, so you look at like this Anna Marie Frankich.
I think he's right. I mean, I think this stuff is going to happen, but I think we could add more recommendations as of now since 2015, especially stuff that we can, you know, if you're replenishing sand every single year
In Eastham,
yeah.
yeah, but that's not,
The
so you're
report that
thinking
you
that,
sent
where's
us.
it all collecting is what you're wondering? Is it coming up and screwing things up here, or?
There's that, but I was also thinking like, there's no recommendation for dredging also. Like, so you know, it says like removing, like all these, like the Herring River, all these like areas where everything's all dammed up. But also part of this is the backfilling of the harbor. That's a tidal restriction.
But what you're talking about is not what generally is meant by dredging in Wellfleet, which is around the marina. You're talking about sand coming onto Grants?
I think, yeah, there's two, I think I'm like touching on two things.
Okay.
There's, when you were talking about the wind and stuff, there was, you can see, if you have people putting out sand to replenish areas.
Yeah.
That's all going somewhere all the time.
Yeah.
And that's going back into the harbor. And then I'm talking about dredging as a separate topic. Not only, I'm saying the inner harbor too would be good, not just the channel, but areas that are restricting tidal flow, like the mooring basin. That's a tidal restriction. And up in Duck Creek, that's also a tidal restriction. Like all that, not only are the tidal restrictions of the culvert going under the road and the old bridge and all of that, but like the actual backfilling is also a tidal restriction.
What I'm trying to get at is, do you find that this sand or sediment being transported is affecting a grant that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure Brad down the way of Indian Neck there, he gets sand. I think you guys do too, don't you? You guys get sand on your nets?
I think you're confusing part of it. You're asking a question.
Am I?
Yes, because the state mandates that if you build a rock wall, you have to do beach renourishment, because the rock wall is changed the way the sand came out of dune naturally. When people do beach renourishment, they're not doing it to build a beach, they're doing it at the same ratio that if the wall wasn't there. So the sand that comes out of the dune
Yeah.
is supposed to be doing that.
I don't think I'm talking about like the sand going into, like how they do on Indian Neck, like backfilling into the rocks and stuff. I'm talking about when like an entire beach is gone. And I understand what you're saying, they have to
That's
put
because
it,
the rock wall has created that problem. And that's why the beach manure
That's what screws it up.
But wouldn't that,
So then the armament has to be adjusted through beach renourishment. So the state has a chart, and the sand will come out of the dune naturally, at so many cubic yards per year. When you do beach renourishment, you put it in front of the wall, or on the wall, the same yardage that the state says would have come out of it naturally if the
Right.
rocks weren't there.
I get what you're saying, but if we keep redoing that over and over, where does that sand end up?
Well, if we didn't do it,
Yeah.
and we didn't have the rocks, it would be coming anyways. I think that's the part that we're missing here.
Yeah.
If there were no seawalls, that amount of sand would still be coming into the harbor.
I think, yeah, Wellfleet Harbor is naturally filling in from the sand coming off the
All the
backside.
dunes.
Yeah.
So, do you guys both, does everybody not think that dredging would be a good?
You mean harbor dredging, not the marina. We're talking primarily right now.
I was talking about the marina, like the inner harbor.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
well,
that,
marina's
yeah.
different, but the sand, in the report that you sent out, there was talk about, bottom migration, sediment migration in the bottom of the harbor. And what the conclusion was that I read in that report was, yes, the sand moves back and forth, but generally it's being deposited eventually in the same place. So you're getting highs and lows that are getting higher with the sand that comes in.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
So, how would you mitigate that?
Well, like he says, it's gonna come anyway.
You would dredge, because if you look at the sand flow chart, it comes from Burton Baker Beach to the break.
Yes.
It comes from Powell Landing to the pier. So all those beaches do dump into the marina, if that's your question.
Yeah, that's,
Maybe I misunderstood your question.
yeah, I think
That's
that,
what they're
yeah,
doing
that-
right now.
that's,
Because if you look at the old low tide areas, the breakwater low tide, there's 6 feet of water in front of it.
that's exactly what I'm getting at. So,
So yes, you need dredging
in
because the
the
sand
inner,
sediment has moved. No matter who put it there, it still ended up.
exactly, that's what I'm trying to get at. So there's no recommendations for dredging, as a mitigation technique for all of these climate change outcomes.
Well, I wouldn't be brave enough to go ahead and recommend somebody dredging at or near a shellfish grant. But the interesting question is that you've raised, and I hadn't thought about it, and neither had Seth Tuller, is how does the movement of sand around the harbor affect shellfish grants? I mean, when people talk about dredging, we mostly think about boats. I mean, you've raised another question, and it's, as Al says, it's for sure true that people who build a revetment are required to replenish the sand in front, but I have a suspicion that sand doesn't stay there as long as natural sand does. I could be wrong about that.
So the problem on my grant, which is opposite where the jetty sticks out,
Yeah.
is not sand. It's the slime from the black custardy stuff going on that's not settling. And sand would just be building up the ground, right?
So
Or
your
covering
grant is
your
over
gear.
pretty close to
Right on
the,
Mayo Beach.
near,
Right next to you
near,
guys. We're right on Mayo Beach.
Near-
He's there too, all three of us.
So
We're
do
stretched
you
out.
believe that dredging would help your grant? I think it would.
I think it
Oh, I
would.
think-
I
I
don't
think
think it's
dredging
the
would help
sand that's the
everybody's
problem,
Yeah,
though.
there's nobody it would hurt.
John's
I mean, I-
statement that he was concerned about dredging too close to a grant,
Yeah.
I would think that would be
That-
incorrect.
That's what I was
Okay.
thinking too, because
I would think that if you dredge in front of her grant, our grant, the slop,
Yeah,
mayonnaise,
yeah,
on the edges of the bank and
Yeah.
go back
through
into
the hole, it's
Yeah.
gonna go back down.
the one right behind the break wall too, so that whole bar moved out and made another Cape Cod. If you knocked that out, it would flush so much more out and literally
Oh, yeah.
clean so much.
The
Yeah.
observations that John,
It would help shellfishing like immensely.
right, but so at what point do we look at what is natural and happening to the harbor, and at what point can we
Yeah.
just terraform?
what?
As of last week,
I know.
and you already touched on it. The water comes in, goes around the Great Island,
Yeah,
on the
every
north
year.
corner,
Yep.
And it comes around every year. This is the natural.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
I just wanted to supply that, because that stuff is going on irrespective of revetments and so forth. And I, as far as I can make out, this was happening before revetments and before the pier was there. And Shirtail Point is evidence of that.
Yeah, they do it every year. They fill in Keller Corner, and then all the sand comes down to the
That's
Max
why there are all
Seafood,
those
and then we take
groins
it
the
back
whole way
to
down.
Keller Corner every year.
Used to be groins? Yeah, now they're just like this big?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Metal prod, I bet
Yeah.
you find them up
Yeah.
near the high tide mark,
I
under
think,
the dirt.
I think what I was trying to say though is,
It's all filled in.
Let's
Just comes back to short tail.
let's get back to Dave, go ahead.
I think what I was trying to say though is that some of that like, and what Becca was saying, what I was kind of getting at was that, what is natural from those tidal restrictions and what isn't, and what happens, like how Helen said, naturally, you know. But I think dredging if you're recommending things to help shellfishing and help the harbor health, that would be huge. And to dredge next to Grants would be, Buddy Barrio was saying that the last time they dredged, quahogs just went all around the edges of the harbor. So that must have something to do with more flow going in and out, you know, which would occur when there was more.
The other advantage of dredging is that middle metal marsh, as John was talking about, and upper Duck Creek, the bottoms of the marshes are actually going lower because there's not the natural replenishment. Like the old days, people used to have sand rights. I don't know if some of you younger people remember, but cranberry farmers would sell the land, people to build houses on, but they'd keep sand rights, which meant they could go in and get soil and take it and dump it on the grants because the plants keep eating the nutrients, and the bottom of the cranberry bog would settle. And the same thing happens in a natural marsh. And we're not replenishing that. It's all ending up in the boat slips. That's just rotted, as if you were listening at the conference today, that's just rotted vegetation that's come out of there but couldn't get pushed back in because of our, now we say man-made causes. We've interrupted this flow, this normal flow that Helen was talking about, and that would have pushed the stuff back up in there. Because there is a countercurrent that comes down, according to one of the studies, along Indian Neck. You referred to that too, the sand getting spread there, filling in.
Something that I heard at the State of the Harbor Conference, and I've heard it around on the flats a lot too, is, you know, could we get a study done to determine whether perhaps creating an opening underneath the pier, the marina pier, to allow better tidal flow in and out of Duck Creek, would that help restore natural circulation and water health, and B, avoid perhaps the need for dredging because you have better water flow over time? So maybe that is a recommendation I mean, again, it's another study, but you're not ever gonna be able to do it
No.
unless you study it. And I really have heard that quite a bit.
Yeah,
The study?
The answer is that in the first harbor management plan, which was from the mid-nineties, there was sponsored a study, was done by a well-known scientist, Graham Geiss, who's now at the Center for Coastal Studies. And they looked at chopping off the marina pier, they looked at building channels underneath, a few other things, and it was a modeling study, found no benefit. And
Okay.
you can see that report on the NRAB website. Up in the upper left, there are links, and there's a link to Appendix A and Appendix B, and I think this is Appendix A, is his report. And the first half of it is pretty technical, but then he gets to the conclusions, and they're, in terms of what you were hoping for, it's not hopeful, but It has been looked at.
It's funny how much I hear it, and then they
Yeah.
talked about it at the Harbor Conference, and nobody brought that up, that it had already been done.
I was waiting for Agnes to say something about it, because she works it for the Center for Coastal, and she didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. Sorry, I can't put words in people's mouth.
John, this is,
Short-tail point has been there forever. It's a natural occurrence.
What?
So Short-tail point has been there forever, more or less. It's a natural occurrence, so
Sorry, I don't know the term Churchill Point.
Short-tail.
Oh, shirt tail, oh,
yes.
okay.
it's been there forever. That's why they paved it, because it was
Yeah.
already there. So how is it, the harbor already does that on its own. Why would we be putting a hole in it? Like, I get the idea that it might stir things up anyway, but nature put it there already. It's just gonna come back.
Well, if you look down the pier,
This is not going to be popular. I think getting rid of the brine on Lizard Sledge, I'm looking at Nancy, right way to refer to that,
The breakwater?
the breakwater, and opening up, getting rid of the railroad trestle sort of bottleneck there, where the railroad used to go over Duck
Yeah.
Creek. And that, by the way, is recommended in one of the two wastewater committee.
That was also recommended by Geis. He was not charged by the NRAB to study that specifically, but the last paragraph in his report recommends doing that.
Taking off the
Remove it.
railroad trestle?
Yeah.
It's recommended in one of these too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Stuff
here's
cooler.
the thing, that breakwater, I understand what it does and how it protects things, but when you look at it from the air, there's something that doesn't happen there with water coming out of Duck Creek, coming in and coming out, coming in and coming out. And I wish that the people who have grants there would think about, is this something that helps us? Or is it just something that was put there because they wanted to get money? Okay? I don't know the answer to that. But the question is, what would happen if that wasn't there and the water went in and out of the channel much more freely?
you're talking about the breakwater at Indian Neck.
The jetty.
Burton Baker,
The jetty.
at Burton Baker Beach, or,
Yes, not the one that's on Lizard Sledge.
yeah, there's only
One that
one
has
over
the
there. But, I
beacon.
mean, you're not talking about anything in the,
No,
beyond the pier.
there's one much further down Burton Baker Beach.
The other thing that I was thinking so I would think that dredging of the inner harbor, obviously taking out the railroad trestle and all of that too, would help. But if you increased propagation, that would also help to mitigate all of these implications for shellfish and shellfishers and the additional community. But you would have a hard time doing that in areas that are already mucked up. It would just add to the tidal restriction. So you would have to dredge first and get that stuff out of there and then propagate like heavily if you want to combat climate change a simple way. You know? Well, not simple, but
Of course, the bars, if you put in an oyster bar in there, that's another cause of an eddy, and an eddy is what makes sediment drop down.
well, I know. So, but the other thing I was thinking too, if you wanted a way to like combat climate change that a lot of these committees could do would be to propagate shellfish all around the harbor as a way to, say like there's all this runoff going off Oysters can clean a lot of that,
But that's where we're running into all the problems with all the people who don't want the wastewater committee to put out millions of oysters, because then they're gonna hit the market and they're gonna tank the market, and it's gonna be all kinds of contaminated product on the scene, and Wellfleet's gonna lose their name and reputation. And did you go to that meeting?
Yeah.
Because that was the whole thing, was we can't let this happen, because that stuff's gonna hit the market.
Well, I'm
What
not
about if
saying,
you
I'm not
just let 'em
saying that,
grow?
I'm not saying using oysters as a way to take out nitrogen. I'm saying just to propagate the harbor, like for a wild harvest, as it would just be another way to, it's not a silver bullet at all. It's just a way that would help you know, and it's not, I don't think there is enough science to back that would like be, like, this would solve all of our problems at all. I think sewering would be, and I wrote that as one of my recommendations to combat climate change would be sewering. Like actually sewering the place.
Yeah.
And
would help.
stopping like just getting at the,
Well,
whatever.
But to Rebecca's point, if we decided that for some reason it was necessary to greatly increase the number of shellfish around the harbor, maybe a new Kerley report would show a big deficiency. Could areas of the harbor be considered as a sanctuary? No commercial activity, is that allowed?
You can do it for 3 years, and then the Division of Marine Fishery makes you open it.
Okay.
but we don't have anything in our water that's gonna really mess up oysters. The only thing we have to worry about, as far as I can see, please correct me, is the bacteria and virus that live in our oysters. That's the only thing that really contaminates our oysters. You know, more nitrogen, more phosphates,
Well,
you know,
also,
could cause other issues in the harbor.
wouldn't black mayonnaise create an issue for our oysters and quahogs?
There's nothing in
Can't
it.
live in
They
it.
can't live.
Well, they can't live in it because it's so fine that it blocks out the ability to get the oxygen. That's the
I think that would
big
be a
danger to
problem,
you
though.
guys, yeah.
I think that would
It's a
solve
real big
that
problem for
realm
you
of
guys.
issues.
And with the septic thing, like, we're kind of walking that line between reminding people that these are bottom feeders and that any septic waste that may be coming out because we need sewering is getting eaten by these things. And on the other hand, we want to promote our brand, and oysters are wonderful, we should eat them raw.
Yeah.
And
That's why this is
the-
like a real
and
conversation.
This is a problem.
But there
This
is,
is why we can sell blood clams, because we can sell them to China where their harbors are too contaminated. Like,
but there is,
But should
there
we
is
not
a,
talk about it for that reason?
well, it may not be the best idea to be looking at getting rid of our nitrogen loading and
But the-
other things as
The
specifically
study that
oysters.
Agnes Mittermeier. I
Right,
think
she
it
did
is,
say that it wasn't,
It wasn't
was mostly
toxic.
plant
It
material,
has
but that
nothing,
was,
there's no human
that was what
impact.
was in the
Human
black
waste.
mayonnaise, though, was specifically plant material, and that's not necessarily
That's
some
Duck
stuff.
Creek though, and
Okay.
right at the slips there, so I think that's pretty
Okay.
encouraging. That's not what she's finding there, it's the detritus
plant
from
material.
natural
Okay, that's good.
vegetative material,
but
yeah.
there is, you mentioned septics, or the word septics popped in. With climate change, I mentioned that at least in New England, you could get more rain.
Yeah.
So the groundwater level is gonna
Right,
go
and
up.
we all have,
And
were they
so the
tidal leaks or
groundwater level
whatever?
is gonna get closer to
Yeah.
the bottom of the septics, and
and it all
that's,
leaches out into
and
the
it's gonna
harbor.
leach out. So
Our
that,
supply, our drinking water supply as well.
there, apart from just managing the waste,
Mm-hmm.
there's a long-term, there may be a long-term need to do something, say along Duck Creek, that deals with the question of whether septics in the future will be as efficient as they are now.
Well, our septics here in town, one of the biggest problems, we've got going like crazy to Title V. And Title V doesn't work here,
No.
because of sand. So you have no leach field. Your tanks work, they do their digestion, but in a normal part of the world, you would have soil. We have sand. So we have this really nice, clean liquid that's full of dissolved chemicals. The nitrates, the phosphates, your hormones, your antibiotics. That's the biggest danger. There's no, you're not getting a lot of E. coli or any, things like that generally from these systems, but you're getting all of these dissolved chemicals in there, and that's where we get the blooms, and you get, or John's, you get a rise in water, and you're gonna get an abnormal flush of this heavy loads of nitrates, phosphates, or I think also Nancy, most of the time you close the beds after heavy rain is not because of the septic, it's because the surface was off.
That's the other thing that I was gonna make a recommendation towards too, is like, so you can see all the runoff coming off. You could make a containment chamber for that. And like, areas where it really comes in and pump that out and remove that. And
Yeah, that's the big danger. That's why we put the
But that's actually a recommendation in
I was gonna say, we
this
recommended culverts and
It's-
that they go through and clean out what there already is.
and clean the water out.
Yeah, clean out the gunk in them that was keeping them from
It's not the
cooling
gunk, it's
and
the
sorting
actual
and
water.
actual water.
If you just put it, if you let it go into, I mean, obviously you would have to, I mean, that's
you
expensive.
get road wash off. We had to do that by the
That's a
the
thing.
masons.
I mean, that's a
They
thing
put
that
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 in there.
happens.
But you're right, more of that wouldn't hurt, because you get the runoff from oils and, car debris, asphalt, well, you used to get, asbestos from brake linings, at least you don't get that anymore, but the stuff that runs off of the surface is nasty.
I had one more too that I was thinking where it goes climate change outcomes, warming water and air temperatures. And it talks about, more fish coming up that are not from around here if we remove these tidal restrictions, did all that. And a lot of the recommendations are moving grants. If we looked into alternative species and using the grant space for a different thing, like weir fishing, if you're having these species move up, like black sea bass and menhaden and stuff coming into warmer water, use a weir and exploit that. And if you have ocean acidification happening and you're trying to grow oysters and the shells are decreased, you have an option to weir fish.
Right, and then
Especially
run
if you
into
have the Herring
multi-use
River
harbor
opening up.
problems and,
So,
Before the dike was there in the Herring River, there was a weir there.
I know, I've talked to Helen about trying to get weirs back, so, but you could, if you are starting to open up areas, that would be a new way to make money and also not have, and we're gonna have these problems happening, maybe not in my lifetime, but in Jake's kid's lifetime,
They're
for
going,
sure.
I mean, the blood, was it blood clams,
blood arcs.
yeah, are a new market, I understand. I spent my summers on the shores of New Jersey. We used to get blue caul crabs, which properly cooked are superb. I understand they also eat
So are
young
children.
oyster spat, but in 10, 20 years, they could be in Wellfleet too. So that's a new business, but it would be a competition with the oysters. Those sort of changes are bound to happen.
There are
and we
blue
have to-
crabs in Wellfleet.
Get out
Not
of
enough
here.
to,
No, you can't commercially
yeah,
harvest them.
but they'll be commercial eventually.
Really?
As the water warms up.
See like
How's
2 a
that
year.
possible?
I've caught them in lobster
Probably
traps.
show up according to my Kiki, which is why we had it mentioned in our blood arc regulation.
Blood arc, okay.
When we drafted that, the state doesn't have one, but we have. My Kiki said, think about putting ponderous clams in there too. It's another blood arc type of clam, it's got some on them. Because he said they like the warm water and they're probably going to be coming up. Can I just ask you guys, nobody has mentioned the microplastics. And the microplastics which Gabrielle loves, there is science in it. Really? What is the presence, what are, I don't know how to make the verb agree. Microplastics in black custard, microplastics in the harbor, what is known about it?
Anybody ask Agnes?
What?
Did anybody ask Agnes that at the conference, whether the black mayo has microplastics in it?
No, I was trying not to speak so much.
I don't think.
So I had talked to the Shellfish Advisory Board on email, like via email, about doing something about reducing plastics in the harbor. And, I was supposed to talk about it at the next Shellfish Advisory meeting, and this is a Shellfish Advisory meeting, so I can talk about it now. So, and I think I was hoping that we could try to find ways of like reducing single-use plastic in the harbor and like finding new ways of like new materials to use in place of 10X or less, and grow bags and stuff like that, and just asking engineers, the help of engineers and the public to help with with that project, you know, so that we could address something before, like, the future of microplastics in oysters, like, becomes an issue, you know?
I think it already is an issue. I just would like to have some
Well, I can tell you-
information of it, because it's coming out of people's septic systems and stuff.
They
If you go
studied it.
to a study from the 4Cs, you can see there's some information on it, and if you talk to Owen Nichols at the Center for Coastal Study, there's information on it too.
Owen Nichols did it in the Pleasant Bay study, they mentioned microplastics.
They did it in
There's a-
Wellfleet Harbor too.
There you go.
They've been measuring it here?
They just recently did.
I think that the idea of, working with shell fishermen to reduce the use of single-use plastic that could be a really huge first step, and Wellfleet could be a leader in the aquaculture industry if, we take our time to look at different options and share them with people.
Plastic's tough to get rid of, to eliminate totally, but you think about nylon.
You might
that's a
not be
kind of
able
plastic.
to eliminate it totally, but you might be able to use
Wood.
like how I was thinking, like how I said in the thing, like how Poland Spring reduced the amount of plastic in their bottles.
There's hardly any now.
I mean, maybe we'll get a bunch of crap grow bags, you know, but like at the same time, you might really help a situation, or maybe use like a hemp-based plastic or something like that, you know? I mean, you're always gonna have plastic. I can't see not using it, but you could reduce it or find ways to try to reduce it.
Dave, a few years back, we had the recycling committee
Yeah.
come to our meeting, and they talked about plastics in the harbor, and we can invite them back and seek out their ideas.
Everybody keeps telling me to talk to them.
Yeah.
And
She's gonna contact you. Lonnie Briggs.
Lonnie Briggs, yeah.
I did it, I did half of it.
But is the source of the plastic local, or is it
Right.
worldwide, basically? I mean, is it coming, it's everywhere in the
Yeah,
ocean?
most of the stuff in the ocean comes from Africa or Asia.
But obviously, we
Very
need
little
to do
from
what
North
we
America.
can locally, and, but you look at these studies of birds in the Pacific that are, guts are full of plastic.
I want to switch gears, and then we can come back and wrap up anything. This paper I sent around is a list of shellfishing access points, which I got from the Shellfish Advisory Board several years ago. One of the activities that the Natural Resource Advisory Board undertakes is also to advise the Board of Selectmen about coastal and pond access. There used to be a coastal and pond access committee, which Tom used to be the chairman of, and then he up and left town, and the committee kind of died, and so we took it over, and glad to have him back. I had two questions about this list. Is it complete? I'm pretty sure it isn't, because I know, for example, that Nancy just made an arrangement with CYCC to,
Not yet, but working.
we're working on it, for an access through their beachfront. So I'd like to have, at some point, the list as complete as possible. I was very pleased to hear that Nancy was working with CYCC on an agreement. And I'd ask you to think about whether a similar sort of agreement might be useful for some of these other access points which go across private property, not town property. It seems to me that would be some long-term security about being able to use the access point. And the third question, are there any new ones, are there any areas of the harbor that are really difficult to get to, and you'd like us to think about other ways to get to it than are available now?
South side of Lieutenant Island. And where,
Anything on Lieutenant Island?
yeah, you used to be able to drive a truck out there, and now you can't. And then what's
Where,
that?
which part?
Remember how you could drive all the way?
Go all the way out West Meadow Avenue. And then
Oh,
it's been
yeah.
blocked, it's been blocked off because you'll be crossing the Audubon territory there.
Really hard to do anything there. And in that area where the old Audubon grant was, you could walk down a set of wood steps, and the people really don't like you doing that. And then you can cross another person's yard and go down like a set of stone steps, and I'm pretty sure they don't like you doing that either. It's really hard to get out there. It's like impossible to get out there without a boat. Or you can hike. Jake used to hike out there.
There are paper roads out there that the town can open. Conservation
There is.
Yeah.
allowed one to be sealed off when a rock wall was built because in the order of conditions, it ran beach grass, but before we did drive out there. So if somebody pulls out one of the original rock wall things, they'll show you where the paper road actually went. And it's not all in Audubon, it was
Now, you're talking on the outside of the island?
It's kind of like halfway in between the boathouse. If you're at the boathouse and you look left and you see that like rock wall,
Right where the second island starts, right?
yeah, sort of out there.
Make a
Yeah,
left.
and then you
Okay,
can
so I
keep
go out-
going
then you
way
can-
out along. What's the name of that road, John? You just mentioned it.
West Road?
West
West
Meadow
Meadow is
Yeah.
the road that runs out to the south corner of Lieutenant Island.
Yeah. So
the
if you
second
follow the
island.
coast back, kind of halfway in between. Dave was saying it would be nice to have an access point there. I don't know if there's any sort of town land or.
I remember you used to be able to drive there, and you could park your truck there, and there was a point, I remember, being a really little kid, and I remember being able to drive around that area.
Yeah.
And then,
How did you drive there? On West Meadow Ave or before you first crossed over the
you
bridge?
used to just be able to, you could just drive right after the bridge and just take a
Make
right
a-
and drive around.
Well, yeah, well, that used to be, that is the real road. That's where the telephone poles are.
And then they closed that off.
Well, there was to do on that, that's when I was running the committee, we ran into that. That road now has been abandoned long enough that it's being washed out. I mean, it's physically hard you couldn't drive down there as well as you could years ago.
I think for us, though, risk a vehicle.
Because now I always end up going over the top and then turning right and go down towards the boathouse.
Yeah, I mean, you can get there. I'm talking about the boathouse, but then you can't get to that. It's just,
Northwest corner.
yeah, it's just really hard to get there.
Right, and there's a land grab, if you watch, Conscom has asked the town recently to take a lot of the town-owned properties out there and convert them to conservation land. So,
That's a land grab?
that's a land grab.
That's as long as they understand that access in
It should be kept
perpetuity
open,
for
yeah.
shellfishing.
That's what I'm saying, they should be, they are concerned of using that land. And once they get it into conservation, then you have to work with them.
Yeah, but the northwest corner is
They're not gonna
is a difficult
restrict
place to get to.
shellfishing.
Yeah.
I mean, fair enough, you can walk along the beach, but if you're talking about driving or dragging dragging a sled along there, that's a tough.
That's like really hard.
Well, when it
Yeah.
comes to shellfishing
Yeah,
access, that whole area that's up high on the hill there is like, it makes it difficult, even just carrying like a 10 quarts worth of oysters up and down those stairs. I used to know a property, I had a listing where there was a property owner right there, and he used to let me oyster there. And the walk up and down those 108 steps or whatever it was to get up to the top was brutal. And, you're certainly not driving anywhere out there, but that's another thing for the ambitious that like walking.
People do it.
So you could explore private property owners out there. There used to be, John, what was that one that got abandoned for one way or the other? They used to be right down there where you go up and it was 4th Street, I think it was, or something like that.
That was at one time listed as a town property, but that was a tax taking, and the taxes got paid, and so it came off the market.
Okay, so there's ways, there's, properties change hands often enough up there where, like for instance, those 108 steps, redoing those steps every 10 years or however often they had to do them was probably pretty financially, a little bit tough. Maybe they'd be willing to exchange access for helping with their steps.
Well, isn't that a public stairway between those two properties down there? there's that stairway that goes down, I don't know. I use
The one
it.
that's marked Joanna's Way,
I think so.
it's got like a split rail fence.
Go up.
Sunrise,
You drive
sunset.
all the way down to the end of that northwest corner,
Yeah.
and there's a house called, I don't know,
Blanky's and
Larry's or Blanky's house or something,
Yeah.
and there's a stairway that goes straight down from there, but I thought that was between the two properties.
There's one that goes off, there's a stairway that goes down to the west, and that one, I believe, is privately owned, and they have big signs up, use at your own risk, and you should. And then if you go up to the north, this Joanna's Way, it's actually landscaped, and I was told that that was a way to water there for the town, but I have never looked into it. I just know that it's active.
Well, I think what we're getting at here is that this list was done quite a few years ago already. It's incomplete, and there's probably places that maybe you guys like to shellfish now, or that would like to be able to get to, that would be worth trying to explore access there, and this would be something that should be updated, and try and figure out ways to, again, to accomplish what you want. If you want to get to a certain place, and you want to be able to even drive a vehicle out onto the beach there where you used to be able to, then let's try doing that. And I think what you need to do is you need to publish something like this, I hate to say it, and make it open and notorious, so you're doing it year after year, and it becomes an established way, kind of like the boathouse is. People go there and they use it, you know?
That just reminds me, I think that's a great idea. It's important to get it out in the public domain. The tract of land, the boathouse and the path to water there from that little parking lot is owned by a house that's
Up in the
kind of
middle of
far
the
away.
island,
And
yeah.
so, but I think that there might be like an opportunity to perhaps request community preservation funds to purchase just that way to access for the recreational fishery, and obviously commercial too, but that's a recreational fishery for the greater part of the year. And if the town could invest in that, it would ensure its way to water, if they'd be interested in separating it off from the main house.
That's a complicated issue, because the family that owns that, I'm on the Open Space Committee, and we've sort of gone around and around with them. They wanted to give this property, but yet they wanted the boathouse to remain in use for the shellfish guy that's using it now. And so the Conservation Trust was going to buy that, but then they didn't want to deal
didn't want
with
that
any
use.
property on the land itself, or any buildings on the land. So it's still up in the air. I mean,
Yeah.
they're still deciding what they want to do, and it's a
They seem to
great
be
piece
open
of-
to it, but
They are,
Yeah.
it just got so
Yeah.
complicated.
There is access on the south side of Lieutenant Island at the end of this West Meadow Road. If you drive out Lieutenant Island, you just keep going, get onto the second island, it bends to the left. And I've seen shellfishermen out there, but they're dragging sleds along. And I think it will be difficult, as they say, to get driving onto the beach there.
Even if not driving, but just a little bit closer, because, I mean, you can get to, there's a parking lot and you have to stop at the parking lot, but there used to be a road that you could drive right to the water's edge. And they put a rock there.
Well, that crosses Audubon land, but there's a new director at Audubon now, so maybe I should go have a talk with her and see what we can do.
I remember going there and driving my truck there.
That's always been open, though. Whenever we ask them to show us the deed, they don't have one, so it's negotiable.
Yeah.
You can still drive out there and park pretty close to the water, but you gotta just that last like couple hundred yards, right?
It's like a football field.
Yeah, all right. Oh,
When you drove out there, you drove to the right of the parking lot, correct?
Drove to the right of the parking lot.
There's some conservation
Are you talking about that piece of land that's like right on the water there? So, yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
Well, I can tell you, number 5
Update
is fine,
this
John.
for me, and
But it also has boating
any
access.
suggestions that you have, then we'll try to follow up on that.
Now, the recreational are mostly seasonal, right?
Where?
And all these are.
That's what the R stands for.
Oh, yeah, so that would be October 1 through May 31st,
Right. Summertime, you just have,
just Indian Neck.
Indian Neck is.
Make sure that these notations are correct. Correct, too.
Right, so landing is where you can launch a vessel?
In principle,
Yeah,
not always.
I gotta tell you, this was my personal interpretation. I didn't base any of this on law, and, but this is, I believe what the town had, that they were
That's what it
calling,
has.
they were calling them
I guess the
landings, they were
harbor
calling them public access.
Yeah.
Or they were calling it,
well, we ran into,
A landing is a public access to the water, which has been, at some time, approved by the Board of
For boat.
Selectmen as a landing.
a boat landing.
Yes,
That doesn't
that's the
mean that
key.
in practice today, you can actually get a boat there. There's
I
a
see.
parking lot at the foot of Bank Street. That's the oldest landing in town, and you'd be challenged to launch a boat
Yeah,
out
but
of there.
you should still be able to, also means landing shellfish.
yes,
that
the
means-
original, when we were doing the work on the first list of these, we ran into these legal definitions. And a landing didn't mean you could go launch your boat there. The landing meant you could land your boat there and unload your product.
That's true.
Right, and go
So
back,
over
go back
time-
to your another place, right?
Seeing we've become more auto-oriented than boat-oriented here, the useful meaning is is changed to what John said, that it's a place where you can launch a boat. And,
Different
But
which is-
we in the Shellfish Department, like on Lieutenant Island, and, in a lot of places around town, you could land anywhere, but we require you to land at a landing.
Right,
So
that's,
if you want to go fish on the northwest corner, then Joanna's Way is where you need to be landing.
right, because then you can keep track.
Because that's,
Yeah,
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 so,
that's
so
perfectly
we've
logical.
used
Yeah,
these
this is
ways to
just-
water as
The
landings.
idea of launching boats was just kind of something that just acquired meaning over the years. It's never been defined.
Any last-minute thoughts, comments? I will try to put together some notes. They're bound to be deficient, so please don't hesitate to offer suggestions or improvements.
I was gonna say on not only I got like on the catch basins for runoff, maybe we could put nets, which would have to get cleaned out frequently and everything, but they make those, like, the municipality, like, nets at the bottom of culverts that can catch garbage and stuff going out. So it doesn't get out in the harbor, and then the DPW would clean that out. It's like a big sock that goes on. And then the other thing, I was just gonna ask, what comes of all of these recommendations and like what we just talked about, like what happens now?
A very good question. We'll put together a report. For various reasons, it may not show up until the spring. That's because people take off in the winter, including myself. We take that before the Board of Selectmen. What would be great is if you could put together a shellfish plan, which is a lot shorter than a harbor management plan, and have it ready at the same time. We could make it, be glad to make it a joint appearance.
Which would be to like update this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what is your time?
Started that last year?
We started.
This winter, it's a winter project.
It's like some deja vu, but yeah.
People go away in the winter, and it's tough to get things done, so
April.
April, May, June, something like that.
Okay. We'll work on it all winter long.
Completed by 2020 sometime, right?
I'll have a computer with me, so I probably will do most of the writing. I'll try to do that.
So the two things that we could do is maybe recommend something like a Kerley Report and update the shellfish management plan.
Right.
Right.
Well, the Kerley Report could be part of the shellfish management plan from your perspective.
Okay.
But be sure to include this discussion about access. There's no reason why that shouldn't be part of the shellfish plan. You gotta get to the shellfish before you can grow them. Thank you, Helen. Night.